Hi, Christian Church in the Upper Midwest. My name is Anne Cartwright, and I am the owner of Epiphany Bookkeeping, which specializes in bookkeeping for churches, nonprofits, and creative businesses. I am an ordained disciples minister and have served in various ministry roles within the church for about 10 years. Prior to that, I was raised in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and in the Upper Midwest for 8 years. So it is really good to be with you, to be home, even if only on video. In the last church that I served, my interest in church finances began to grow in some unexpected ways. More and more, I noticed that any time money was brought up in church meetings, in congregational gatherings, and even in conversations with congregants, the temperature in the room seemed to shift. Things became more fraught, more tense, even if the conversation or meeting up until that point had been filled with laughter or joy at the work of the church and its ministries. We don't like talking about money, do we, church? Money has the capacity to hold so much negativity for us, doesn't it? Guilt and shame and fear and sadness and desperation and scarcity and pain, isolation, secrecy, power, uncertainty. Our culture is one that continues to tell us over and over and over that we don't have enough, that we aren't good enough, we haven't earned enough, we don't deserve enough. And that's just in our personal finances and our personal money lives. You know, it's no wonder that when we come together as church to talk about money, that things get fraught. We bring everything we know about the stress of money in our own lives to the table when it's time to talk about the church budget, or the rise in ministry expenses, or the dwindling of the endowment or giving. We live in a world of scarcity mindset, church. No wonder we enter conversations about church finances with the mentality of, there's not enough. We don't have enough. We are not enough. God tells us over and over and over and over and over again in scriptures, do not be afraid, church. Do not be afraid. I think it's crucial before we enter into the work of church finances that we always take a moment to breathe, to center ourselves, to remind ourselves about who this work, particularly the financial work, who it's for. When I began my bookkeeping business, I didn't intend to serve churches. I happened to be working at a church in Dallas, Texas in an administrative role, and they needed help figuring out their bookkeeping. They had tried a variety of ways to keep track of their finances: volunteers, a paid administrative person, an outside accounting firm. They no longer had enough people to serve all the necessary roles in the church, particularly those that required financial know-how, and they needed help. As my bookkeeping business began to grow over the last few years, I've talked with a lot of churches that have run into the same issues. Finding church members willing to take on leadership roles in the church has become harder, especially financial leadership roles. And let's be honest, church finances take some work. There are a lot of pitfalls and risks and confidential information to be recorded accurately, timely, and with utmost care. Add to that the fact that money is one of the hardest things to talk about in the church. And it's a tough job, especially when all of your presentations are marked with fraughtness and tense vibes. But it's necessary for the well-being of a church, for transparency and accountability, and to ensure that the financial gifts given to the church are used faithfully towards the mission and purpose of the church. And it's true that the church is changing. It has been changing, which is very hard for a lot of people to see, let alone find joy and a willingness to change along with it. We are in the midst of a new thing, like God describes through the prophet Isaiah. Do not remember the former things or consider the things of old. I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. It is time, church, for a new thing, for new ways of being and living and serving God. It is time for a new way of counting our success as churches that isn't dependent on amount of money or number of members. It is time for a new way of doing the work of the church, a new way of doing the financial work of the church. It is time for a new way of talking about money together, church. I'm not going to touch on stewardship in the short time I have here today, but I do want to point you towards the Center for Faith and Giving if you have not been acquainted with them yet. There are some incredible resources they offer about the ways giving trends have changed, how it varies by generation. They have resources for how we talk about money as a church throughout the year, so it's a more holistic and integrated part of our life rather than just a few stewardship sermons when it's time for that annual campaign. And I highly recommend that you begin a conversation with them. What I want to offer you today are some questions regarding church finances that you can take back to your churches and thoughtfully consider together, as well as some ideas about how the financial work of the church might be changing for such a time as this. When I receive a budget for a church, whether it's a potential client or a potential church to join and participate with, there are a few things I immediately look for to get a feel for what the church's mission and purpose are. First, I look at what the church is paying their pastors and staff. Does the church pay a living wage for the area they are in? Is the church generous in caring for the people they have hired to help lead the work of the church? Is the church equally generous if there is more than one pastor? How we care for our own and those we have called as our own shows a lot about who we are as church. I know more and more churches struggle to provide a living wage for just one pastor, so ministry must get creative. What other shapes can pastoral leadership take if not a full-time pastor? What are the ways a church can be generous in time, in lessening expectations, in celebrating its leadership? Churches who are absorbed in the scarcity mindset of the world around us frequently become places of exploitation for the people who work and serve there, whether they are paid or not. This includes the courageous few who are willing to step up and volunteer to work in church finances, by the way. We must take care of those who serve and lead church, or we will not have people who are willing to do so. The next thing I look for in a church budget is how static a church budget has been over the last few years. Especially these last few years, considering that we have been in and are still in the midst of a pandemic. If your church budget is the same as it was prior to March 2020, your budget is out of date. Ministry has changed in the last few years. It is still changing. Our budgets reflect where and how ministry is happening and the vision and hope for those ministries. If the budget is static, I'm guessing that the church and its ministries are as well. Let's not be afraid to try a new thing, church. Our scriptures are filled with the people of God being challenged with new ways of doing and being. Could we approach budget changes or hard financial decisions or even regular financial meetings as a chance to really dive deeply into who and what God is calling your church to do and be in the specific time and place in which you are located with the specific resources that you already have, rather than a fraught attempt to hold on to what was, to what is no longer working, has not been working, to that which you are no longer called. One last thing I want to invite you to consider is, how do we teach church members to read and understand our budgets through the lens of our ministries? Some churches do what's called a narrative budget, which takes all of the line items in a church budget and splits them according to the ministries they support. And then a story can be told about how the church's money is being used and put into action. Others might offer budgeting classes for personal budgets, or perhaps how to read the church budget for new leadership. to help those who are stepping into new leadership roles feel more confident, more prepared, and hopefully less stressed when seeing the church budget on a regular basis. There are things about church budgets that don't really make a whole lot of sense to someone who has never seen or understood one before, particularly because income giving varies on a month-to-month basis. We can teach people about church budgets and its idiosyncrasies so they are more equipped to talk about the church's money, so they are more equipped to engage in conversations around budgets, so there's more transparency and openness, and how we talk about church money and budgets can be different. The more a church talks about money and budgets with care and honesty, the easier those hard conversations become, the less fraught. Maybe even in the midst of the most difficult financial conversations a church can have, there can even be some joy and gratitude, because there are still gifts being given. There are still resources to share. We may just have to look for that new thing happening among and within and around us. So thanks be to God, who continues to move in and through us, who is still calling us forward, even if in a new way. May we listen, may we share, may we keep learning, and may we talk about money differently, church.